like to say hello, everyone. We're waiting for Zoom to allow everyone to join the room. Should be another 10 or 15 seconds or so, and then we'll get started. Okay, hopefully it's been long enough now. Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to this Duke Media Briefing. I'm Greg Phillips with Duke Communications, and I'll be moderating this panel. We have 4 Duke scholars with us today to discuss the treatment of Black citizens by police officers in the US now and through history, and the protests that have spread across America in the weeks since the killing of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis. I'll introduce our speakers and get the discussion started, and then we'll open it up to questions. We are recording this briefing, and that recording will be sent to everyone who registered. Thanks to those reporters who already submitted questions via Zoom. During this discussion, I encourage those of you who are on Zoom to submit questions at any time via the Q&A window. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions out loud in a few minutes. So we'll get started. Our panelists, with us today we have Jim Coleman. He is a professor of the practice at Duke Law School, where he is director of the Center for Criminal Justice and Professional Responsibility and co-director of the Wrongful Convictions Clinic. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Adrienne Lentz-Smith is associate professor and associate chair in Duke's Department of History, where she teaches courses on the Civil Rights Movement, Black Lives and Modern America, and she is working on a book about police violence during the twilight of the Civil Rights era. Good afternoon to you. Also with us is Mark Anthony Neal. He is chair of the Department of African and African American Studies and founding director of the Center for Arts, Digital Culture and Entrepreneurship at Duke. He specializes in Black popular culture and teaches courses on topics including Black masculinity. Good afternoon. And finally, Ben Grunwald is law professor at Duke, who studies criminal procedure, criminal law, constitutional law, policing, and empirical methods. And his recent research found that fired police officers are twice as likely to be fired again in a new job. Good afternoon, panelists. So now we will get started. Professor Coleman, Derek Chauvin has been charged with third-degree murder in George Floyd's death. What are the elements of third-degree murder? How do you see that case unfolding?
Well, third-degree murder is a form of homicide based on the defendant having shown extreme indifference to the value of human life and having engaged in conduct that was inherently dangerous. It is a form of implied murder. That is that it's not intentional, but it was done under circumstances that are the equivalent of having been intentional. This case is going to be like a law school exam, because while the conduct itself, I think, clearly rose to the level of extreme indifference to the value of human life, the issue is really going to be whether it was the cause of Floyd's death. And the autopsy report did not conclude that the officer's conduct was the cause. It said that it was one among several factors that may have caused his death. The family obtained a independent autopsy, which concluded that his death was a homicide. So that's likely to be the issue at his trial. And I don't think it's a slam dunk that he will be convicted of murder or even manslaughter.
Thank you for that, Professor Coleman. Obviously, there's a lot more to dig into there. But for now, Professor Greenwald, all 4 officers involved in the death of George Floyd have been fired, but you've studied what happens to police officers after they get fired, and what have you found?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. So for decades, we've known that police officers who get fired are sometimes later hired by other agencies. And, just to give you an example, a famous example is Tim Lohman, who just a few years before he shot and killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, he was forced to resign from another department in Independence, Ohio. And even after that, even after he killed Tamir Rice and was fired in Cleveland, another department tried to hire him again. So in a new study with John Rappaport from the University of Chicago, we call this phenomenon the wandering officer. And we conduct what we believe to be the first systematic empirical investigation of wandering officers using data from Florida on all police officers hired in the state of Florida over the last 30 years across 500 agencies. And I'll just highlight a couple of our results. One of them we've already heard. So first in the paper, we count up the number of officers working in Florida today who are wanderers, that is, who have previously been fired and are now working for law enforcement agencies in the state of Florida. And we find that today, roughly 1,000 officers are working in Florida agencies who've previously been fired, and that represents 1.5% to 2% of all Florida officers. And I should say that these are probably underestimates in Florida because we suspect that some officers have been pushed to resign while under investigation, and while some of those cases are captured by our data, not all of them are. Second, we find that officers who get fired, who get further work in law enforcement down the line, tend to move to agencies that are smaller, with fewer resources, that serve communities with slightly larger populations or communities of color. And finally, we find, as you mentioned, that wandering officers, particularly those who were fired from their last job, are twice as likely to be fired again compared both to rookies and to other veterans who have never been fired. And we similarly find that officers like this are twice as likely to receive complaints at the state licensing board for moral character violations, including complaints for violent and sexual misconduct. I have more to say about the paper, but for now, I think I'll end there. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the introduction, and we'll certainly dig into that some more later in this briefing. For now, I'd like to move on to you, Professor Neal. The killing of black men by police, even when they're unarmed, is often defended as a response to an immediate threat. But how has the image of black masculinity through American history helped create the situation in which police officers see black men as an inherent threat?
You know, embedded in white supremacy has always been images and ideals that help justify the treatment of black people. When you think about the way blacks were treated during slavery, there had to be a system culturally and socially that helped to justify the inhumanity that was directed towards black folks. And we've seen this play out all the way through the 20th and 21st century, particularly with the emergence of media culture. So when you think about the role of someone like Jack Johnson in the early 20th century as being kind of a metaphor for the bestiality, if you will, of black folks and black masculinity in particular, and how we see this image go all the way through the culture well into the 21st century. One of the things I talk about in my book, Looking for Leroy, Illegible Black Masculinities, is this idea that there are certain ways in which black masculinity and black folks more broadly are legible to the larger public. And one of the ways in which they're most legible to the larger public is in this notion that they are criminalized, in this notion in some cases of being athletes, as being superhuman, so much so that they resist certain forms of pain. And it's important not to divorce this from the moments that we're having even now within COVID and the kind of inequities that we see in the healthcare system, where there's long been data that suggested that there are folks within the medical profession who believe that black folks can withstand higher amounts of pain than their white peers. And thus they are often underdiagnosed because of that. And by the same token, it takes 4 police officers to subdue a black man who's in handcuffs as another example of thinking that somehow black folks are resistant to these kind of form of pain because of these images that have historically circulated that suggested that somehow they were not human, that they were less than human or even more than human in some sort of context.
Gotcha. Thank you very much for that. And if anybody missed the reference, Jack Johnson was the first black heavyweight champion of the world who reigned from 1908 to 1915. Professor Len Smith, I'd like to move on to you. America has a history of police killings and protests. How does this moment fit into the broader sweep of a very long civil rights movement?
I'll give you a short answer to a small question in 2 minutes. And I'll preface it by saying that my sort of riffing on Mark's previous comments is that what we're seeing right now are the deadly persistence of ongoing stereotypes and stereotypes that have served a purpose, and that purpose largely being the concentration of racialized power in the hands of a very few. How does this fit into the longer history of either the Black freedom struggle or of white supremacy in America? I'd say that one answer to that question would be that what we're seeing right now is what happens to a dream deferred. If we're talking in terms of the protests on the streets and the way that people are responding, you're seeing the consequence of folks first asking, then pleading, and then waiting and getting fed up. And this isn't the first time we've seen, right, these outbreaks in response to the failures of American democracy, or for the outbreaks in response to the failure of American democracy to be really a democracy that works on behalf of all Americans. When I think about the ongoing police brutality and the number of men and women who've been killed in the sort of immediate past and in the past few years of this, I also think of outbreaks that responded to similar things in the 1960s, right? I think about the Newark uprising, which was kicked off by an incident of police violence. I think also of the classic petition that the Civil Rights Congress carried to the United Nations in 1951, We Charge Genocide, where they actually start with a list of the number of people who've been killed through violence, legal and extra legal. Historians always talk about changes and continuity, right? I think when you think back to these past moments or past outbreaks, so much of the time what you see is a muddying in the line between extra legal violence and legal violence, between the vigilante, the mob, and the police who are somehow mixed in with the mob. What's striking about 2016, one of the things that makes a change, and one of the things that I would argue is a response actually to some of the successes of the mid-century civil rights movement, is the way in which the extra legal, although it still happens, isn't as necessary, because the forms of state violence that target and disproportionately wound and murder African Americans have made some of that vigilante action less necessary. And I think that's part of what you're seeing right now, right? Is that when people not only believe that the system won't work for them, but when they believe that the system is designed to work against them, then you aren't going to see a lot of people having faith in trying to create change through that very system.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. Well, we've heard from all four of our panelists, and there's certainly an awful lot to talk about here. I'm going to open up the room now to questions from the reporters on the call. I would remind you, if you're joining us on Zoom, you can type a question in the Q&A window or raise your hand. If you're calling in by phone and you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand by pressing *9, and we can unmute you so that you can ask your question. First of all, a question that we have from Stephanie Ebbs at ABC News Washington is, how have economic inequality and issues like food insecurity contributed to the protests that we're seeing now? But Professor Lentz-Smith, maybe you could continue and maybe tackle that.
Sure. I think that on some level, the protests that we're seeing right now are a statement about the cascading failures of the state to take care of a broad swath of its citizens, right? And if we think about what civil rights activists at mid-century and before were asking for, what they were pushing for an end to a system of politics and economics that was rooted in gross exploitation. They were pushing for the vote, sure, but as an instrument of making change. They were pushing for sort of care for well-being, broadly speaking. That meant economic security, right? That meant sort of working people's rights so that people could live on the wages that they earn. And they were pushing, yes, also for a change in sort of understandings and senses of each other, right? We tend to talk about the sort of love and the squishy feeling part of things. We don't tend to talk about the radical critique that was part of the movement. We did a lot of the sort of legal infrastructure to make the larger change stick that we hoped, but we didn't actually pull back and ask the hard question and commit ourselves to the answer of whether or not people have a right to security, right? To have a right to economic well-being, have a right to eat. And in fact, the limited steps that we've made on the way to taking care of the broader populace, if we think about something like Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, have been radically undone, right? They were under attack from the moment that the Congress of the 1960s passed them, and they've been rolled back in ways small and large since then, right? So when people are out on the streets and they're in pain, that pain is about being hungry and not knowing what's going to happen 3 weeks ago. That pain is about being disproportionately affected by COVID. And that pain is about all of the slow violence that we've seen erupt into too frequent manifestations of immediate death.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And I certainly have more questions about that, but I would like to pivot momentarily here to another question that we had and come back to you, Professor Coleman, about the specific legal case against, the officer involved in the death of George Floyd. We have a question that says, can you explain qualified immunity and how it makes correcting injustice difficult?
Well, it doesn't affect a criminal case, but it's a doctrine that makes it difficult to sue a police officer in a civil case. What it does is to provide protection to the officer for discretionary acts that he takes in his official capacity as a police officer, unless the plaintiff can show that the conduct was in violation of clearly established federal law or federal constitutional law. And the courts have interpreted that last factor in a way that makes it very difficult to show that whatever it is that the police officer did was not so clearly in violation of established federal law that he should not be protected from a civil lawsuit.
Gotcha, understood, thank you. And staying in the...
Just add one more comment about that?
Please do.
Yeah, so just to echo what Professor Coleman was saying, I mean, we've been hearing about qualified immunity a ton over the last week and over the last few months, and also frankly over the last few years. And as Professor Coleman said, it makes things even harder to sue government officials for violating constitutional rights. And I also just wanted to point out that, we could make good progress by significantly restricting its scope or scrapping it, but there are lots of other problems in litigation, in these civil rights litigation cases, that are also problems. In many cases, they're bigger problems. And some recent work on qualified immunity has shown that in a surprisingly few number of cases is qualified immunity the thing that makes a civil rights case lose, because there are so many other things that make civil rights cases lose. And so I think it's a great idea for us to start talking about and seriously restricting the scope of qualified immunity. And there's going to be some opportunities for the Supreme Court to do that in the future. And we should also be cognizant of the fact that it's not going to solve our problems, and we've got to do a lot more stuff too. Thanks.
Gotcha. Thank you for weighing in on that. I actually wanted to follow up with you, Professor Grunwald, going back to your study. And as you followed officers in Florida that were fired and then worked elsewhere, did the study at all track the reasons for the firing and whether officers had been fired for misconduct as it pertained to brutality or violence against people? I think you're muted right now.
Thank you. This is a frustrating part of the project. It's extremely hard to get data. So one thing I should step back and say is extremely hard to get data on multiple agencies in the United States because law enforcement is just so highly decentralized. This is a core problem in this area. We've got something like 18,000 law enforcement agencies, and almost none of them share the same boss. And so what that means is that we have very few opportunities to have data that track the movement of an officer from one agency to the next. And it's a small miracle, given the way we've got our policing system set up today, that we even have data that we do about firings on all agencies in Florida. But what that means is that in Florida, we don't have all the information you'd really want. We'd love to have more specific information about exactly why a police officer was fired, and we don't have it exactly in Florida. But we can see the difference between an officer being fired for example, failing to satisfy training requirements. We can separate those out and look more specifically at the firings of police officers for violating agency policy. And that gets us closer to the kind of conduct that you were asking about. And when we look, regardless of whether we look at the full category of firings or the category of firings for misconduct, our results across the paper look remarkably similar. And I'll just say one other thing. While our firing data doesn't tell us about exactly what these police officers are doing, the complaint data that we have provides a little bit more information, and we can categorize the kind of conduct in which they engaged. And so, like I mentioned, we can see that wandering officers, when they get hired, end up getting moral complaint violations alleged against them at twice the rate for violent and sexual misconduct claims. And we find a similar result when we look at integrity-related complaints. So complaints about perjury and false witness and false documents and other related issues related to fraud. But that's the best we can do with the data we have right now.
Gotcha, thank you. And I have a follow-up there, but I'm going to come back to you in a few moments. Professor Neal, you study popular culture, and one of the questions that we've had is, right now, today on social media, there's this Blackout Tuesday that's going on. Like, how much of a difference can social media campaigns like this do? Obviously, awareness is important, but we need so much more than that. So can these make a difference, and what more can be done, socially, social media-wise, to actually do what needs to be done to start to address this problem?
Well, at least in terms of social media, and I'm thinking in particular of that formation that we call Black Twitter, it has been most effective to the extent that it's been able to force national corporate media to pay so much more attention to what's happening in many of these cases. If you go back to 2013, for instance, and think about the shooting death of Mike Brown, it was actually after 1 million tweets about his death that we finally got a primetime news story about Mike Brown's killing in Ferguson. And so what social media has done very effectively is galvanize different groups of people, particularly across races. It also gives celebrities a platform to talk about what's happening in terms of these protests. In terms of real policy shifts, we've yet to see directly how social media activity will directly impact policy. But in terms of generating attention to these issues and generating eyeballs to certain kinds of subjects, it's critically important. You've seen this play out in particular around National Basketball Association players, particularly during this George Floyd moment, where many of them have taken to their Instagram accounts, their Twitter accounts, and other ways to express their concerns about what's happening in the country. And in some cases, I'm thinking about the Ohio State Buckeyes and also what's happening with the Washington Wizards. Literally those corporations, those teams gave up their social media to their players to be able to articulate their concerns about what's happening in the country right now.
I'd also add that there's a way in relation to the protests specifically, social media has given people a more fine-grained picture of who's involved, right? That it's very easy to lazily report things as a mob or to assume a certain kind of homogeneity. And what you see are these coming together of different groups, sometimes in solidarity, sometimes in agitation, but who are out on the streets. And in certain instances, you've also seen coverage on the flip side of where are the police and what are they doing, right? What is happening to people that we might talk about in a sort of broad and imprecise way as pushback or, sort of a stern response, getting tough, to use some of the favorite language, and folks reporting on being gassed on their porches, right? Actually gives people who are watching from their homes a better sense of what's happening than they might get when local news outlets are overtasked and can't be everywhere at once.
I mean, to think about even some of Professor Lynn Smith's research for a current book, thinking about how important, for instance, television was to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and how SCLC and SNCC and Martin Luther King, Black Panther Party, all of those organizations were very cognizant that if they wanted to tell their stories, they needed to be out in front of the cameras, and they needed to utilize popular culture in different ways to do that, whether that be in terms of television or film, or in particular popular music. What we have now are a generation of activists and protesters who simply are incredibly media savvy. And instead of having to use or having to need corporate media to be able to capture what's going on, they're able to use handheld devices and social media to be able to tell stories on the ground with that kind of specificity that Professor Lynn Smith just mentioned.
Absolutely, thank you both for that. And that actually feeds nicely into a question that we've had in the chat, which is, what's the best way for college students or other young adults to encourage systematic change? What would you encourage young people to be doing right now that want to help?
Wow. I think we see some of it playing out in some American cities. We've now seen a generation, because again, you know, some of these folks have come of age in Ferguson in 2014, in Baltimore in 2015. Some of these young folks were actually on the ground in 14 and 15 that are now veterans, if you will, of this kind of protest movement. And so what young folks can obviously be encouraged to do is to speak their voice, to be able to support institutions. And we've seen, for instance, on Twitter, lots of young folks and even more older established folks, you know, donating to bail funds for protesters who have been arrested, you know, over the last few days. There's so many different ways in which they can do this. One of the messages that we continually hear over and over again, of course, is that young folks also must go to the polls, that they must vote. And the same kind of passion that we encourage young folks to vote, we also have to have the same kind of passion around conversations around the way that particularly African Americans in this country have been systematically disenfranchised in state governments and in the federal government in terms of their ability to be able to vote, right? And young folks know that there's a disconnect between these desires and demands for them to vote and the fact that there are Black folks who are actually losing the right to vote at the same moment that we're having these conversations.
And there, you know, I always say to the people who, I mean, I just said that the vote was not adequate, but it's necessary, right? And I always say to the people who argue that the vote, they don't vote because it doesn't matter, that one, things can always get worse and holding the line against worse is very important. And two, the fact that so many people are trying so very hard to keep folks from voting is a sign that voting must matter somehow. So in this period when we're seeing, you know, the president brainstorming ways to disenfranchise on Twitter, then we need to make sure that we defend, not just for African Americans, but for all Americans, the franchise as an instrument for supporting and sustaining democracy. And I would also add that political will is not something that happens, it's something that's produced. And so if there is change that you want to see, then you have to combine kind of the new technologies of communication and community with old-fashioned, boring spade work of building a social movement from the ground. It is boring and unglamorous, but it is necessary. It's not boring, but it can feel boring.
Could I also add to that? I mean, I agree with what you've said. But it's not just to vote. I think it's also important to get involved in politics. In 1968, when I was a student, I think, you know, we were the world was falling apart the way it is today. And we were in the middle of a presidential campaign. I think one of the most effective things that students of my generation did was to get involved in Eugene McCarthy's campaign and took down a president. Unfortunately, they didn't have the stand power, so when McCarthy did not get the nomination, basically they dropped out. But I think not only to get involved, but also to stick to it, because it's very difficult and you don't always win the first time out.
Gotcha. Thank you all for your response there. And Professor Coleman, I'd like to stay with you. We've had a follow-up. In your opening comments, you made the point that the conviction of Derek Chauvin in George Floyd's death is not a slam dunk. Could you elaborate on that and your thinking around that?
Well, so there are two aspects to the case against him. There is what he did, and we all saw that. And I don't think there's any question that what he did was inherently dangerous. And I don't think that there's any question that it reflected what we would say is extreme indifference to the value of human life. The issue, though, is going to be whether that conduct is what caused the death. And that's an issue that the jury has to decide, and decide in favor of the prosecution. That is that notwithstanding the how obvious it is that the conduct would satisfy the requirements for murder, the question is whether the defendant was the cause of the death. And as I said, the official autopsy report identifies a number of factors that may have contributed to his death. The question is going to be, though, would he have died at the moment that he did, but for the conduct of the police officer? The family has a second autopsy report that concludes that, in fact, he died because of the police officer's conduct. But I think the fact that you have two autopsy reports that come out differently, if the jury believes the state's autopsy report, then I think that it is very possible that they could decide that the state has not shown that the police officer caused Floyd's death, notwithstanding the conduct.
Gotcha, thank you. And since we're back to talking about specific police conduct, with Professor Greenwald, we've got a follow-up question for you that asks, when a police officer is fired and rehired, does the second hiring agency know why the officer was fired the first time? And if so, is there any evidence that they purposely overlooked that?
Yeah, so we don't actually have very much information or knowledge at all about why police agencies are hiring wandering officers. And that's really unfortunate because, of course, the reason they're hiring wandering officers would go directly to our policy responses to it. But there are, a few possibilities. One is that they just don't know that they're hiring wandering officers. And that could be because they're not running background checks, or when they do run background checks, those background checks are ineffective. And it seems possible that in a substantial number of these cases, police departments may be hiring wandering officers without knowing it. The obvious question then is, if that's really the cause, then what's the solution? And one obvious solution to these kinds of problems is to have better state and national databases. The fact is that most states already have databases that track the decertification of officers, and we also have a national database that tracks the decertification of officers, but both of them are full of holes. For one thing, the databases generally only contain information about officers who have actually been decertified. And when I say decertified, I mean that in a sense like you need a license in order to practice in a particular area, and you can only do it with that license, and if we take your license away, you've been decertified. So it's really hard in law enforcement. However hard it is to get fired, it's really hard to get decertified. And so most fired officers are never decertified, and so they never make it into the state database. But the other thing is that many states don't even report that information to the national database, even if it's in their state database. And so there's two different problems here. And so one of the solutions to get at the question that you're asking about is to strengthen and reinforce and fill the gaps in these databases. But it's also possible, it's possible that in a substantial number of these cases, the police departments do know that they're hiring wandering officers. And in fact, anecdotally, I've seen statements from police chiefs saying things like, what, you think I'm not going to give them another chance? Of course I'm going to give them another chance. And so I think that happens in a substantial number of cases, and exactly why, again, is hard to say. One possibility is they just don't appreciate the risk of hiring them. And hopefully more research will be able to, research like this, and more research will be able to establish that that's not true, that these officers are quite risky. Another possibility is they know, but this is the kind of officer that they're looking for. And this is one of the problems that we're dealing with in the culture of policing right now. And finally, going back to issues of liability, as Professor Coleman talked about, it's hard to sue a police officer in a police agency for example, violating a constitutional right. And so in many cases, police agencies might know that they're hiring wandering officers, and they might know that that might come with a risk, but they haven't fully internalized the future costs of that hiring for the community, because in the end, they won't be forced to pay if they get sued.
Gotcha. Thank you very much for that. Professor Lent Smith, would like to come back to you. You've studied intensely the riots of the late 1960s. Obviously, another flashpoint in particular were the Rodney King riots of 1992. We've had a question that asks what kind of similarities and what kind of differences you see in what's happened over the last few days compared to the late 60s and previous instances of these kinds of protests.
So one of the similarities that I see with the Rodney King riot of what, 1991? I've lost I'm a historian with a terrible sense of dates. But one of the similarities that I see with the Rodney King riot is that we tend to talk about it again as a riot with a singular cause, the beating of Rodney King and the lack of consequence for the police who beat him, when actually it was an expression of broader, again, despair and frustration over the murder of Latasha Harlan and the lack of punishment for her murder. It was about the problems, an expression of anger and frustration over the problems with the LAPD that were going unchecked and often under-acknowledged, right? That is one of these things with LA then, with things that we see now, that just seems to recur, right? That we have multi-causal or sort of expressions of dismay or despair that have multiple causes that we tend to shorthand down to one thing as if that could capture all of it. From the 60s, the difference between the mid 60s riots and 2020, in addition to the passage of what, 60 years, almost 50 some odd years, is a sense that we had a federal government that wasn't always doing the right thing in response to these riots, but that was committed in some broad way to this idea that the government could and had the responsibility to better the lives of its citizens through its action, right? This was a bunch of politicians, and they could be on opposite sides of the argument about race, right? But you have George Wallace on the one hand, the Alabama sort of racist, and then LBJ, the Texas racist, but also the civil rights proponent. LBJ is a complicated guy, but they'd both come of age during the New Deal, right? They'd come of age seeing the way in which government on the ground could do things, not just for their personal ambitions, but for the people of their state. And they had faith in that, and they sort of reveled in the potential of being the person at the helm with the power to do that, right? And that could manifest in things that were deeply horrible and problematic, but it was still something beyond themselves and their ego, as big and destructive as their egos might be. And as much as I resist as a historian reducing things to the individual and their personality, I do think that in some positions, the individual matters. And then that individual surrounded by people in government who believe in government, not just as an instrument of their own gain, but as a place to help the largest number of people live as well as possible. And we need that back, and we have the capacity to bring that back, but it's going to require action on our part and holding more people accountable for their behavior.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Neal, you said in your opening remarks, you discussed how ingrained, in American culture, this idea of a framing of Black masculinity as threatening, how ingrained it is. A follow-up question we've had for you is how do we begin to untangle how ingrained that is? How do you address that?
I think when we look at some of the literary figures that we've had throughout the 20th and 21st century, increasingly what we're seeing in terms of Black film directors and obviously folks in music, it is really about trying to create images that examine the complexity of Black identity and the humanity of Black identity, right? There has to be an active attempt to produce counter images to the negativity that we often see circulate in mainstream media and popular culture. And by complexity, I'm not necessarily talking about good versus bad images, but images that get to the humanity of why people make certain kinds of choices in certain kinds of situations and under certain kinds of conditions. We're starting to see in this moment, because so many media makers and culture makers now have access, for lack of a better way to describe it, to the means of production in ways that they didn't have before. The fact that someone can literally make a documentary on their phone now in ways that it would have been difficult to do 30 years ago. We're starting to see folks create much more cohesive and articulate and also intricate images of Black masculinity and Black folks in this country. The problem, of course, is to continue to be able to circulate them in a way in which the larger society have access to it. When I think about, for instance, popular television, it's been this long held belief that, if you look at the 8 to 9 o'clock hour, right? If you think about television 20 years ago, you will see a fairly diverse image of Black and white America, all of them making fun of themselves. But once you got to the 9 o'clock or the 10 o'clock hour, you continued to see complex images of white masculinity or white folks, but you didn't see as a counterpart a complex image of Black folks in those same, in the 9 o'clock hour programming or the 10 o'clock hour programming. Those are still things that are very real. And because these very stock stereotypes of who Black people are continue to entice folks and continue to bring eyeballs to certain kinds of media projects, it becomes even much more difficult. When you think about, for instance, the franchise like, the Housewives of Atlanta, there are certain kind of stereotypes of who Black women are that very consciously continue to circulate in the context of that series, even though it's largely something that's being produced by African Americans.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. There's so much here to talk about, and I'm trying to get to as many questions as we can. I would remind everybody on the call that if you're on Zoom, you can ask a question in the Q&A window or raise your hand. And if you're joining us by phone, you can hit *9 if you want to raise your hand, and we can unmute you so that you can ask a question. I'm going to try and get to as much as possible before we wrap up. Professor Coleman, I'd like to come back to you for a moment. You mentioned that you were a student during the riots of the late 1960s. And you've spent a career, studying wrongful convictions, studying these kind of things. Do you see much difference over the decades as there's been a depressing number of these cases of people dying at the hands of police officers, in a difference around the perception inside or outside the legal system in how they are processed and whether they are processed in a fully fair and impartial way?
Well, I think that we go through cycles. There are sometimes when the public and judges seem to care, and it looks like we might make progress. And then there are other times when that's not true and nothing changes. And over the long run, I think it's fair to say that little changes. We still have, judges who are willing to accept, the word of a police officer about any dispute. If you think about the Floyd case, if we did not have video of what happened, I guarantee you that the police department would have accepted the claim by the police officer that Floyd was resisting arrest and that the restraint was necessary. That's the problem. We can't walk around, Black people, Black men can't walk around with cameras to film every encounter that they have with a white person who means them harm. So, the fact that we're able to show, though, recently we've been able to show in time after time after time with video what in fact is happening. I hope that's having an impact, and that people who in the past may have, just as a knee-jerk matter, accepted the word of a police officer will now at least stop to try to figure out what the facts are. But that's very difficult, and it requires leadership, which unfortunately I don't think we have a lot of right now.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we have a follow-up question that you might like to tackle, and we could also hear from Professor Grunwald on. A blunt question from Lynn Bonner at the News and Observer. Derek Chauvin had 18 complaints filed against him. Why is it so hard to get rid of bad cops?
Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a bunch of reasons here. The first is that we have, a lot of police agencies have a specific culture, a culture that supports the kind of conduct that we're seeing on the streets over the last week. And so in large part, you have decision makers who think that some of the conduct that renders a police officer eligible to be fired doesn't actually render them that way. So part of it is the decision makers. There was a great optimism about body cameras when they became popular about 5 years ago. Sort of you got the sense that it was just some people thought it was going to solve the world. But the problem is that even if we record these instances accurately, the people who are viewing them view them in a particular way, and different people view them in different ways. And so it matters tremendously who are the people that are reviewing the footage. So, part of it is about the culture and the people in the institutions, but there's other sort of structural things going on too. One of them is, as you probably know, there are really strong disciplinary rights for police officers in a lot of jurisdictions because of union contracts. And good evidence of that comes from the fact that we can actually see how hard it is for police agencies to fire officers even when they want to fire the officers. So with just a little bit of Googling, you'll be able to find tons of stories from major cities in the US where a police department has fired people, and 25, 30, 40, 50% of the time, those firings have been reversed on appeal by an arbitrator. And that gives you a sense, if so many of the firings are being reversed, that tells you how many more police officers police chiefs may want to fire, but don't think they can given the structure of union contracts and disciplinary rights. So I think it's a combination of a lot of factors.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Coleman, just wanted to give you the chance in case you had anything to add to that.
No, I agree with that. I think the most important thing, in the long run is to change the culture of these police departments, both in terms of how they interact with communities, how they routinely are able to use deadly force as part of the sort of normal policing. I think that until we make cultural changes in how the police operate in this country, in the long run, we're not going to really change anything. As soon as the cameras shut off, I think a lot of these officers go back to the same behavior.
Got you. Thank you very much for that. We had another follow-up question come in on this general topic. I don't know if either of you could address it. Have any of the panelists, or are you aware of anybody looking at police culture here versus in other countries? Because obviously there are aspects of this that appear to be a uniquely American problem. But are either of you aware of studies of police culture in other countries as compared to here?
So I'm not aware of specific countries, but I can say that people have done comparative studies, or there's data available about the differences across studies in police departments in different countries. And one thing I should say is all of this is incredibly complicated. Each country is dealing with its own set of problems outside of the criminal justice system, which, as other people on the panel have noted, are driving a lot of the problems we're seeing in policing. But just one example for you is that if you look at other Western countries, the number of times in a given year that police officers shoot and kill their civilians is dramatically lower than it is in the United States. And one of the reasons for that is that a lot of other countries that are not all that different from us in certain ways have police officers walking around the streets not carrying guns, or being trained in different ways, or having highly decentralized systems that are better at dealing with police reform problems than we do in the United States, where, as I've mentioned, we just have such a decentralized system.
Gotcha, thank you. I would remind everybody once again, we've got about 10 minutes left here. So if anybody has any additional questions, you can type them into the Q&A window or raise your hand, which you can do on a phone by hitting *9. Professor Lent Smith, we have a follow-up question for you. Is there anything in the current wave of protests that you see to hang some hope on, or anything that gives you any reason for optimism moving forward? And I realize that's a tough one given how things stand at this exact moment. But
what are reasons for optimism? There are moments of coverage of protesters holding one another accountable for how they want to go forth, even on the streets. right? So this sense, sometimes it's about the optics. Are we going to erase our message if we do X? There's that wonderful video that was on Instagram yesterday of the woman who was dressing down a series of white protesters who'd messed up a bus stop, right? And she was saying, or an internet charging station or whatever, some sort of public space. And she was saying, there are people who use this station. I can tell you the homeless folks who charge their machines there. I can tell you the people who need to go to work uptown at this bus stop. I can tell you all of these things, right? In there, in her sort of beautifully eloquent rage was sort of a connection to a community, an understanding of her community, of the people who lived around her, that I actually found really touching. She also identified herself as a military veteran. And I was sort of like, oh, of course. That's why she's got that sort of like, she's got the volume and the authority and the ability to call people to the carpet. But I saw in her a coming together of experiences that make me, again, hopeful for what people can do. I also, like a lot of other people, saw the circulating images of individual policemen hugging protesters, or the policemen who took a knee, right, in solidarity with the protesters. And what you see there are people as individual actors trying to figure out how they can reclaim or reconstitute a system that is designed for them en masse to be a certain thing or act a certain way. And like, you know, any one person's hug doesn't change the culture of policing. It doesn't change the sort of function of policing overall in disciplining communities of color, but it's the beginning of change, right? And it's the beginning of the possibility of all of us imagining change and wanting it. So that part actually does make me have a glimmer.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And Professor Neal, I'd also like to kind of direct that question towards you in your areas of study. As you look at popular culture and the shifting sands in that arena, do you see elements of hope and things to cling to?
I think obviously, and we've seen this historically when you have particularly young white folks who are attracted to African-American music in one instance and are able to start to hear some of the messages, particularly political and protest messages in the music, that help them kind of shape differently how they see the world. You know, we've seen for 20 years, for instance, the way that young white folks listen to quote unquote gangster rap, you know, in the early 1990s and early 1980s to give them better of a sense of what was happening on the ground in terms of policing and with the policing of African Americans. That gave them a different kind of sensibility about what was happening, quote unquote, in the hood and what was happening in the music. I would argue that many of the young white folks who were sensitized to what was happening in Black life via hip hop in the 1980s and 1990s, as adults, were not afraid of electing someone like Barack Obama as an African American because they had a closer proximity to what was happening in Black culture. And now, as we've seen musical genres and listening audiences kind of blend together, there's always the potential now that white folks outside of Black experiences will get a better sense of what's happening in terms of Black life as they consume Black popular culture, which continues to be, as a genre, whether we're talking about music, film, or television, one of the more popular genres of popular culture in the society.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. I haven't seen any more questions coming in, and we're getting close to the hour mark. So I'm going to take the opportunity now to ask all of you the same closing question. And that is, in your various fields, or whether it's pertaining to the George Floyd case in particular, the protests that are going on, or in your areas of study, what I'd love to know is one thing that you would like to see happen now in order to begin to change something or improve this this situation. And Professor Greenwald, since you've got this very specific area of research, I'll come back and start with you. You know, in the area of police firings, rehirings, what's one change that you think could be made, I guess, at the federal level or at a state level that could begin to improve the situation and make things more transparent?
Yeah, the list goes on and on and on, but you limited me to one thing. So I think my answer would be that I think law enforcement agencies just do too many things right now. Too often they're the first responders to problems of mental health, to problems of poverty, drug dependence, truancy, homelessness, so many other issues. And this just almost definitely isn't something we can train law enforcement to do well. We've been trying for several decades now, and it doesn't seem to have gotten us very far. And I think one good answer one helpful answer to some of the problems we're seeing is just to reduce the duties of law enforcement agencies, divert some of the fundings we use to establish new municipal agencies to try and solve these problems that, for lots of historical socioeconomic reasons, we've sort of been pushing to the police as the last responders when really we need to be handling it more upstream in the system.
Gotcha, thank you. Professor Coleman, what's one thing that you would like to see happen right now?
Well, recently my son and I were talking about how odd it was that, very heavily armed police officers were able to capture, domestic terrorists like the Boston Marathon shooters, and the guy who put the truck of dynamite down in Lower Manhattan, who were heavily armed, but the police were able to capture them without killing them. And yet, a police officer runs up on a 12-year-old kid and kills him because he says that, he was afraid. I think it shows the difference between well-trained law enforcement officers who are armed and basically people who are just brought off the street and given a gun and sent out there in these communities where they are among the most dangerous things in the community. I would hope that we would find ways to limit, who has a weapon to people who are actually trained to use them and who accept responsibility to use them properly in a civilian community.
Absolutely, thank you, Professor Coleman. Professor Neal, what's one thing from you?
So my comment is largely anecdotal. I grew up in New York City in the 60s and in the 70s when police officers still walked a beat. So there was a direct connection between police officers and the communities in which they policed, and even attended to that, where police officers often still lived in the communities. I just simply think that you police people differently and with more humanity if you're actually living with the people that you're charged with protecting.
Gotcha, thank you. And then Professor Lent Smith, we'd love to close with you. What's one thing from you?
Sure, I'm going to cheat and give you two. One of them is very quick though, and that is to let the definition of freedom that is broad and capacious and humane, that was produced within and by the civil rights movement, be the definition of freedom that guides us as Americans. So to think about it as ending economic exploitation, taking care of others, and allowing people the opportunity not just to be, but to thrive. And then the other one is just really practical, which is that it's not rocket science, some of this. Like the Justice Department needs to do its job, and it needs to be as energetic about defending the civil rights of everyday Americans as it is about shutting down critiques of abuses of power, right? So it needs to enforce consent decrees, it needs to guarantee voting rights, and it might want to sort of keep track of the places that have patterns of bad policing so that we have some data.
Gotcha, thank you so much. We will call it there. Certainly we've barely scratched the various surfaces of this thing, but I hope everybody has found it educational. I know I have. Thank you to all the reporters who joined us on the call. Our next briefing is scheduled for June 10th. If you'd like to be included on the advisory for that event, please email dukenews@duke.edu. In the meantime, you can email Steve Hartsoe, who was on the advisory for today, if you would like to follow up with any of the research from our panelists. But beyond that, I would just like to thank our panelists, Jim Coleman, Adrian Lett-Smith, Mark Anthony Neal, and Ben Grunwald. Thank you everybody for joining us. Please stay safe and stay well. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye everyone.